Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. Donnell's Social 9 podcast. This is now Chapter 4, Episode 1. And in this chapter we're talking about to what extent has Canada affirmed, which means basically guaranteed, collective rights. So this chapter is about collective rights. Last chapter we focused on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is for everybody in Canada. Every single citizen in Canada, and even some for people that are just literally in Canada, even if they're on vacation or anywhere, they have those rights. Collective rights, however, are for specific groups of people. So a special set of rights for specific groups of people. So in this chapter, we're going to focus on those special, specific rights, and they're called collective rights. This is not a big chapter. So some groups would be First Nations that have collective rights, and Francophones. French Canadians have collective rights as well, as we'll do Anglophones, but we'll be focusing mostly on First Nations and Francophones this chapter. So, one sec, sorry. So a few key terms throughout this chapter. Not too confusing. There's a few that are a little tough. So you got on the far right side there, you got ethnocentrism. Basically, crazy fancy long word that means that you believe your culture is superior to someone else's. So this would have been when Europeans first came over to and discovered Canada, not called Canada back then, but the belief that their culture was superior to all other cultures. That's ethnocentrism. You got ones like assimilate, so mean to become part of. So the idea of when the Europeans came over, trying to assimilate First Nations into their culture. So trying to make others almost forget their culture and become part of your culture. That's what assimilate means. Sovereignty, the idea of running your own nation. And again, a lot of these are in the vocabulary sheet that you're going to have to do, because quite important in this chapter to know a lot of these words and what they mean. And we're going to continue forward here. So focus questions for this chapter. What laws recognize collective rights of First Nations people? So what are their specific collective rights? In last chapter, again, we talked about Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This chapter is collective rights for specific groups. What collective rights do official language groups have under the Charter? So you're looking at official language groups of Canada. We have two, English and French. Okay, Anglophone means English-speaking Canadian. Francophone, French-speaking Canadian. And the third one there, what laws recognize the collective rights of Métis? Again, not a big chapter. It won't take us long to go through this. And on this slide here, you can copy that link onto Google, just some extra information on what it's like being First Nations in Canada at the time, and more information on what's known as the Indian Act. So, unlike the United States, Canada has entrenched collective rights in our Constitution. So that word entrenched means it is in there for good. It's not coming out. Again, think judicial branch, any laws or bills that are going through there. They cannot break our Constitution. They cannot break our Charter of Rights. And now they cannot break our collective rights. They're all entrenched. Means they're not, you can't take them out. The purpose of collective rights is to affirm the collective identity of groups in society and to create a society where people of different identities belong. That's essentially the purpose. To recognize the special individuality of these specific groups. So the specific groups that have rights guaranteed in the Charter are the First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Francophones, and Anglophones. And just some, where do all this legislations, where do all this stuff come from? How does it relate to collective rights? So you can take a pause here if you want, take a look at this. But you got collective rights. Where does it go to from there? So to the right, you got Francophones and Anglophones. That's basically right in Canada's Constitution. Going to the left, you got Aboriginal people going towards First Nations. The Indian Act, we're going to bring up quite a bit this chapter. You're going to have to know quite a bit about that. And how a lot of people, when they think of the Indian Act and how First Nations were treated, it goes right to the negative. In this chapter, you will see that it wasn't always like that. At the beginning, it was actually quite beneficial for both, and then along the way, which we'll see in these stories, things went wrong. So in the First Nations one, you got Indian Act, historic and modern treaties, and Canada's Constitution again. For the Métis, you got modern treaties, so you got no historic treaties there. The Manitoba Act, again, the Constitution, and the Inuit modern treaties. So the only one there with historic treaties is First Nations. Excuse me. So what laws do we have that recognize the collective rights of First Nations people? So we're going to kind of go through these together, and we'll also discuss these in our live classes as well. What are the numbered treaties? So we're going to learn that. They're historic agreements that affect the rights and identity of some First Nations in Canada. Okay, historic agreements is key there. The Proclamation of 1763 was first to recognize First Nations rights to land and establish the principle of making treaties through peaceful negotiation. Other laws also affect collective rights of First Nations, including the Indian Act and Section 35 of the Constitution. You don't got a crazy lot of stuff to learn here, but the Indian Act, basically when you see the word act anywhere, okay, it's extremely, extremely important bill or law that we're talking about. Okay, the last one, you had the War Measures Act. The government used the War Measures Act to put people in camps throughout World War I and World War II. Here you got the Indian Act, and it's still actually called the Indian Act, although we don't use that term really anymore, but the act is still called that. Agreement between the Queen and First Nations, because obviously when Canada was first discovered, it wasn't Canada. We were a colony of England, and that's why the Queen is still the monarch of Canada. The head of Canada is the Queen right now. So, at the beginning, First Nations agreed to share their lands and resources in peace. Canada's government agreed to terms covering First Nations education, reserves, annuities, and other matters. This is going to get brought up numerous times this chapter. So we look at Canada, First Nations agreed to share their land and resources in peace. Great. Canada's government agreed to terms covering First Nations education. So they were going to provide education for First Nations. Sounds great. It doesn't say how they're going to provide the education, and we'll get to that later. How the reserves are going to work. Annuities are yearly payments. And then we got for First Nations, the numbered treaties are sacred. So throughout this chapter, you really want to understand that although the treaties are basically agreements, one party, which is the government, look at it as business. Business is business. Take your emotion out of it. It's written on paper, on documents. This is the way it is. When these treaties are made with the First Nations perspective, they're considered very sacred, built on friendship and trust. So even though they're saying the same things to each other at this time, at the very, very beginning, there's already a different belief on how things are going to work. There were many reasons that number treaties were negotiated, and perspectives play an important role in the interpretation of the treaties. So later on, we'll be going through some of the treaties, at least the ones that take place in Alberta, and how you'd think when something said like, we're going to provide education for you, it would be pretty simple, but it's really not. And it's the perspectives of how do the First Nations think about education, and then how does the government at the time think about education. So the perspectives play an important and an incredibly intense role in some of these treaties. Okay, so with this chapter, with this episode, you're really only focusing on the vocabulary terms that are important for the rest of this chapter. But I'm going to read a little bit here at the beginning so you can kind of get an idea of the beginning of chapter 4. Have you ever thought about what makes Canada unique? What makes Canada different than other countries? Such as our close neighbor to the south, the United States. Here's one thing that makes Canada unique: collective rights. Collective rights belong to groups of people and are entrenched in our Constitution. The purpose of collective rights is to affirm the collective identity of groups in society and to create a society where people of different identities belong. Collective rights are part of the dynamic relationship between Canada's government and the Canadian citizens. Throughout Canada's history, laws that affect collective rights and the promises of the government to uphold them have created opportunities and challenges for Canadians. This chapter presents some history about collective rights in Canada. As you read and listen, evaluate how effectively laws have affirmed collective rights. So how good of a job have we done? And consider what implications this history has for Canadian citizens today. That's it for episode 1. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.